MQD, moral question of the day.
Here is Camille, the sociologist.
This is Taylor, the journalist. Here is Jan, the psychologist.
Now, let's find this moral question of the day. Let's see here. How does moral obligation influence our will to aid others? Wow, what a great question.
Actually, a recent story relates to this. In O'Melveny Park, a young boy aged 10 was drowning after he tripped and fell into the river.
Someone help, I'm drowning! Help me!
An onlooker raced to the scene and he aided the boy out of the water. Why would he do such a thing? Were his decisions made out of pure moral will, or would he merely receive fame from his actions? If he has to put himself in danger, does he have the obligation to aid the child?
Well, thank you, Jan, for telling us that tragic yet heartfelt story. However, one question arises. Why did the man even help the boy? What were the causes of his actions? Why would he ruin his Prada shoes just to save a mere child? I believe, though people may argue morality emanates from an innate moral instinct, a cultural lens focusing on the issue of moral obligation reveals human behavior relies upon cultural and social custom, because human development stems from peripheral influence, thereby preserving cultural custom. In my opinion, the man did not pose an innate instinct to help the child out of the water, but rather, through society's teachings, he developed his moral code, creating an obligation to aid the child. Through social restriction, human action relies on the influence of social custom to determine the extent of moral will to aid others. According to a recently published article, Cross-National Moral Beliefs, the Influence of the National Religious Context, the author suggests humans lack subjective control of their emotions and actions. Thus, when applied to the religious national context, religious beliefs about morality are transmitted through social structures as well as cultural expectations. The greater the god's power, the more demands they can make. Recent work has shown that belief in a god effectively predicts a variety of behaviors. If religious beliefs transfer through cultural expectation within a society, then one clear cultural implication is evident. The manner in which humans act towards one another stems from cultural expectation. In the face of religious beliefs, humans feel an obligation to adhere to those beliefs, thereby aiding the unity and preservation of a culture through incorporating customs and daily actions. Upon my research, I have also found the article, Initial Impressions Determine Behaviors, Morality Predicts the Willingness to Help Newcomers. The authors imply social inclination towards people affects the subjective willingness to aid people, and even when people are not directly dependent on another person, their behavioral intentions will be driven by the perceived morality of the other party, rather than, for instance, their competence. If perceived morality influences the extent of aid people will grant to one another, then one cultural implication arises. Social obligation resides as the sole moral drive to aid other humans. Though the man was oblivious to the child's existence prior to the accident, he put his life, and his shoes, in jeopardy to sustain the boy's life. The feat of ignoring materialistic items to save humanity suggests the man simply abides by moral obligation. Different cultures have different beliefs regarding different subjects, and religious nations tend to follow religious teachings which restrict human behavior. The man felt an inclination to aid the boy due to sensing the boy's good-hearted soul, because behavioral intentions will be driven by the perceived morality of the other party. Every culture and society holds beliefs in both good and evil. The man must believe, save the good, and shut off the forces of evil from this earth, because if that boy were a criminal, then surely he would not feel any inclination towards him.
It may seem that there is a clear moral obligation on behalf of the man to save the child, but in truth, the extent of this obligation lies within universal moral obligation, a concept that is implied by human equality. Surely, if we believe in human equality, then the man must morally consider his worth indifferent to that of the child's. Therefore, he is not obligated to put himself at any serious risk and is rather obligated not to. If we value human equality, then we must reinforce universal moral obligation, the concept that we are equally obligated to every human. So any kind of intimate or social bias must be overlooked. The man should not help the boy because he feels a sense of obligation presented so directly with the struggle. Alan Wolfe, sociologist and author of the novel Who's Keeper, claims that intimate obligations hinder rightful and universal moral obligation, and that we are better off, therefore, relying on impersonal mechanisms of moral obligation. However, if the man can in any way help to save the boy without putting his physical, mental, or emotional health at risk, he certainly faces obligations. When a man named Morgan Scott, from the Institution of Sociology of Agriculture, of Food, examines the moral obligations of vets onto society, he comes to the conclusion that veterinarians must obligate against the pressures derived from the financial demands of their veterinary business. In this particular situation, the vets had to make a decision of whether to prescribe to business partners a medication for groups of infected cattle at the risk of the public health through indirect digestion of the medication. Clearly, when we have the ability to affect the well-being of other people to some significant extent, we must sacrifice our aspirations and our desires, as a veterinarian is obligated to ignore the financial aspect of the controversy. The man by the river surely is obligated to, without hesitation, sacrifice his shoes for the well-being of the child.
The majority of people who reflect on the story about the man and the boy oftentimes will comment on how it seems obvious that the man's actions exemplify the rightful and moral thing to do. Now, to aid my argument, I surveyed a couple more innocent people to put in perspective how the average unbiased person would react if they were in the exact same position as the man was when suddenly a boy was drowning right before his eyes. The question I asked them was, would you willingly aid this helpless boy if you were in the same position as the man? And some of the answers were, yes, who wouldn't? No doubt, I would definitely jump right in. Of course, it would be my moral duty. Well, the boy would depend on me. I would have to. And I took these responses and I analyzed them through a psychological lens. And I decided that a fine line divides what we as humans ought to do and what we have to do. However, in rare cases, such as the dilemma which involves the man and the helpless boy, no clear distinction exists, and therefore people must find it within their own rightful minds to channel their innate moral instincts and find for themselves where this particular situation categorizes in their minds. Examining this issue through a psychological lens, I trust that the man immediately felt that he was obligated to rescue this helpless boy. And this ultimately compels him to save the boy in the end. Now, most people would call this man a hero, but a psychological point of view believes that the only reason that this man helps the boy is because of a physical and emotional distance that the situation demands, and therefore the man is helpless to do anything but help this boy that is drowning right before his eyes. Now, however, I argue that if another situation presents this very same man with a new moral obligation, but this time with a greater physical distance, the conclusion would be a much different one. To help clarify, I would like to share a study from an article called An Economical and Ethical Approach to Charity and Charity Endowments, in which the authors propose a phenomenon entitled the proximity preference, which defines the reasoning as to why people deliberately choose to help the impoverished people nearer to them, even as those farther away from us endure greater extremes of poverty. If the proximity preference displays an adequate model and also provides logical reasoning as to why people fail to direct their endowments to the rightful groups due to emotional distance, then I can thereby trust that the assumption about the man. If the man who saved the boy in the story were presented with a situation with a larger physical distance, say trying to rescue someone in another town or someone around the world, then he wouldn't feel nearly as obligated to offer his assistance in this dilemma because a greater physical distance would put a burden on that man. Also, there's no direct human and moral code obligating him to help someone in another country or someone around the world, or anyone out of his sight for that matter. So, from a psychological point of view, I can conclude that we as humans do what is morally right most of the time. But we do help keep in consideration what burdens helping those will impose on us. And thus, humans are much more eager to help those in closer proximity to us, rather than those who seem like they're worlds away. Thank you.
Hi!
Hi!
Nice to meet you guys. Welcome all to the MQD panel discussion. Come, have a seat. Let's begin. Regarding the question at issue, overall, the cultural, psychological, philosophical, and scientific perspectives support moral obligation to others. However, very diverse justifications for the topic arise, which implies a tendency of human nature desires to help and give to others.
Exactly. You know, after discussing this topic as a group, we realize a majority of our society dismisses their duties as members of the population, and we now view world problems more openly and with an intent of learning.
I totally agree. Although, under the scientific perspective, finding any objective evidence was nearly impossible due to the subjectivity of the topic at issue.
Yes, Linda. However, the cultural perspective adequately explains the roots of moral will to aid others through examining the extent of human cultural and social obligation to society. However, the cultural perspective fails to acknowledge personal moral beliefs contributing to human action, but rather the cultural view paints people as directly influenced by society.
Well, on the contrary, when delving into the psychological perspective, I believe innate moral instincts are what people must rely on when they face a morally demanding issue, and therefore, evidence supporting the claims was not difficult to find because a psychological standpoint enhances the subjectivity of a human mind. But even so, any factual evidence still fails to exist because of the heavy opinion-based content.
Yes. As for the philosophical perspective, all philosophy infers subjective ideas, which proposes difficulty in finding truthful claims, even as the evidence implies many persuasive arguments. In conclusion, I would say we all believe that if humanity poses an obligation to act morally, and morals are partially subjective, then the extent of moral obligation must be introspective. Since there will never be a perfect answer to questions of moral obligation, humans should approach questions of moral obligation more openly.
Thank you, and that's all for the NQD discussion for today.
Moral question of the day.
MQD, moral question of the day.